Great. Thanks everyone for joining us. Today's speakers are Dr. Lee and Valerie Smikolov. I think I got that close. Uh, Dr. Lee earned her PhD from Princeton and is currently professor in the Civil and Engineering Department at Penn State. She's received many awards for her research and has most recently been named an Institute for Energy and the Environment Fellow, and in 2023 was named IEE's Person of the Year. So congratulations. Um, for her work on river systems and aquatic life. Dr. Lee's research group focuses on the critical zone, which is a zone that supports life and includes everything from the tree canopy to the bottom of the groundwater, and how it regulates its functioning and response to climate change and human perturbations. In particular, her research group is interested in the interactions of water with soils, rocks, roots, and microbes along its flow path to rivers and streams, and how such interactions regulate water quantity, chemistry, and quality. And along with her today to help present is Valerie, who is a second-year PhD student in Dr. Lee's lab and holds a bachelor's in geoscience with a minor in computer science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. In 2023, Valerie was a national laboratory intern at Berkeley Lab, and we're so excited to have the both come and present today. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Lee and Valerie to present their research entitled Vertical or Lateral, Unraveling Patterns and Processes of Terrestrial and Aquatic Carbon Fluxes from Watershed to Global Scales.
I'll just share, right? Yeah. Can you see it? Cool. Okay, so thank you, Terry, for the introduction, and Allison for the invitation to talk. Today, I'm most going to talk about unraveling patterns and processes driving terrestrial and aquatic carbon fluxes. As Terry talked about, Val will be talking about through some of the slides. And this invitation started from DOE announcements in the summer about a new project we have, collaboration with Rodrigo Vargas from University of Delaware and Ben Bon-Labate from PNNL. So I'm sure most of you are very familiar with them. So we are thinking about in this project, so I'm mostly will be kind of thinking, talking through the idea of that project and show some of the work we done before in the area of river water quality and things we can borrow, things we need to kind of continue to think about using some of the existing examples. So when we think about carbon fluxes, we mainly think about two major fluxes. One is the vertical ones that essentially soil CO2 effluxes into the atmosphere. And this has been extensively studied in, in soil and ecosystem biogeochemistry field. And then there's this lateral fluxes. You think about the transport of dissolved organic carbon, dissolved inorganic carbon, particular organic carbon from land to river and stream and eventually to oceans. So this has been more studied in aquatic and biogeochemistry and ecology community. So they more or less been studied in separate field in different communities, in different disciplines. So one idea we were thinking about essentially to try to think about them in and from integrated perspective, thinking about which one is higher or lower under different conditions and how they are going to change over time and under different conditions. Because mostly both fluxes are driven by the same subsurface processes, mostly soil respiration process. So soil respiration, including both in terms of the root respiration and heterotrophic respiration, which generating CO2, some intermediate product as dissolved organic carbon, and soil CO2 can also dissolve into water to become DIC. There's also rock weathering, like carbonate and silicate weathering process produce dissolved inorganic carbon. So these processes drive the vertical fluxes CO2 back into the atmosphere. And when there's a lot of water runs, there's also, a lot of transport with flow to essentially move these material into river and streams. So one thing is another kind of pressing question is about when we have climate change, when there's more events like droughts and flooding and storm becoming more intensive and more frequent, how these fluxes will change and what are their relative magnitude because of that. So I'm giving you one example about how these fluxes could respond to, for example, storms. And this is one of Rodrigo's earlier work. He essentially measured the soil CO2 efflux and temperature and water content after Hurricane Wilma, which is a big Category 4 hurricane, landed in Mexico in 2005. And he measured data in 2006 and 2007. And you can see that from the soil CO2 fluxes, this is a 95% threshold, essentially kind of up bound of normal fluxes. And you can see in 2006, there's a lot of big soil CO2 fluxes up and down a lot, way exceeding, the normal range of these fluxes until at the end of 2006. So it's almost after a year, it didn't recover back to its normal conditions. But you can see that temperature and water content, they return back to normal pretty quickly and have their annual cycle back to the normal these conditions pretty quickly. So we tend to think temperature and soil moisture drive these soil effluxes. But this is saying there's more than just these drivers. So there's other conditions, other processes come into play. So, and there's also a question of, how these different type of response will be different in different places. So the overarching question we are really asking and thinking about is what are the patterns of and processes that drive these vertical and lateral carbon flux response to hydroclimate extremes. And we plan to use two different model approaches. We hypothesize that for vertical fluxes, they may be more driven by physical and biological processes. There could be, for example, at first, there's this physical displacement of water displacing CO2 out of soil very quickly, so leading to these like big peaks at the beginning. But there's a long-term impact on microbial communities, on roots, and all these processes that leads to differences in soil CO2 fluxes. In my experience, like different stages of changes and they have different response and it's over time, it's much longer time, temporal response, and so it lasts longer. But for lateral carbon flux, maybe it's more driven by the water movement. So it's potentially, delaying. It follows hydrograph, but there's a lag in terms of time, and there's different, for example, spread in terms of how much this response would last after the storm or after droughts. But in general, we hypothesize they may be more driven by the hydrological processes. So potentially the response are different in terms of lateral and vertical fluxes, and they are driven by different processes, or at least predominantly driven by different processes. So two modeling approach. So of course we will be comparing a lot of data and everything, but two major modeling approach we're planning to use. One is a deep learning approach, which we're hoping to look at the continental scale or even global scale patterns of these carbon vertical and lateral carbon fluxes. The other is the deep learning model. They could fill the data, but maybe they couldn't give us, for example, detailed, in-depth understanding of the processes. So we plan to also use record transfer model to dig into a couple of sites that have a lot of data and thinking about the processes. So the rest of my talk, I will be mostly we will be talking about deep learning first. So I will very quickly kind of go through some slides about application of deep learning in river water quality side in my group, and then Val will be talking about soil CO2 fluxes using deep learning approach, which is much more related to this work. And then after her, she talk about that, I will be spending a bit more time thinking about reactor transmodeling and different processes. So my group has been using deep learning approach, mostly long short-term memory model approach to understand, to not really understand, to gap fill, essentially temporal field data and spatial field data to look at many different sites, usually hundreds of sites, pulled together. And then we look at the temperature, dissolved organic carbon, essentially pulling all the data together, and then try to having also download the basin characteristic data like soil property, climate, long-term climate characteristics, vegetation, and then coupled with intensive hydrometeorology data to feed them into this long-term as a deep learning modeling framework, and then train the model to have a good match to the data, but then would be temporarily filling a lot of these gaps that we don't have data at all. So then in that way, you get the daily temperature, daily dissolved oxygen, daily total phosphorus, and so we got consistent temporal numbers essentially, and we can look at trend, we can look at spatial patterns. So an example is this: when we look at the river warming, we look at almost 800 sites in US and in Central Europe, and then analyze that trend after the model filling, and then we see majority of the rivers are warming more than 87%. And the faster warming in urban rivers and the slowest in agricultural rivers, potentially due to a lot of irrigation activities. But what's interesting is dissolved oxygen is losing fastest in agricultural rivers. Even the warming is the slowest in agricultural sites, which potentially indicating that in agricultural rivers, because there's a lot of nutrients, so there's more processes that consume dissolved oxygen, which leads to much lower or much faster deoxygenation in agricultural rivers. So these are examples in river water quality field. So I'm going to hand this over to Val, and she'll be talking about soil CO2 fluxes.
All right, thank you. So this slide is defining soil CO2 effluxes, but as Lily talked about, soil CO2 effluxes are the result of soil respiration in the subsurface, which is kind of like the breathing of the subsurface, which is why I have a picture of lungs on the screen. So we see this buildup of CO2 in the soil, and as it fluxes out of soil into the atmosphere, we can measure it using automated chambers, and then use that data to model, to create a global deep learning model for soil CO2 efflux. Can I, or
Oh yeah, I need to advance.
sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
So we use models to quantify the global soil CO2 flux because it is subject to, it's very heterogeneous. We don't really have any methods to measure it at large scales. So we use modeling approaches instead. But most models to date have used annual scale data, which relies on really coarse temporal measurements. So for example, here I have a daily scale data set in gray with some like sample coarse scale measurements taken from that data in red. And I'll just use this to point out some issues with this approach. So if you could advance, sorry. So one issue is that your samples might not be representative. So you might measure just a point that happens to be very low or very high for the season you're measuring. You can also, you miss a lot of temporal variability. So if you measure once per season, for example, you're really missing long-term spikes and you're not gaining a really strong understanding of how soil CO2 efflux responds to short-term events like those extreme events that Lily mentioned. And then in many cases, you don't actually sample some points directly, like wintertime points. So you just use inferred relationships instead. So there's a lot of problems, and annual scale data in general can lead to errors of both magnitude of soil CO2 efflux and the temporal dynamics. So daily scale model is what we would prefer for like the most accurate understandings. So we use a recent database of continuous soil CO2 efflux called COSOR, which has sites that are distributed across the globe and across climate types. So deep learning models just benefit from having a diverse array of sites to learn from. And then they can tell us things like where is the model performing well, where's the model failing, and what is that saying about using deep learning as an approach to modeling soil CO2 efflux. So here on this slide, we look at some of the results of model performance. So we see that around a third of the 82 sites performed well, with a median test NSE of 0.04 and a median test KGE of 0.28. NSE and KGE are like metrics we use to evaluate fit between observed and simulated data. And we see that the NSE is much lower than KGE, which indicates that the model really struggled to reproduce spikes in the data. We then divided our sites into 3 categories of performance. So we had well-performing sites, fairly performing sites, and poorly performing sites. And sorry, if you could go back one to so our well-performing sites we see have really smooth and regular dynamics. So those are 2 words that are going to come up again, but we see that they don't have a lot of spikes until the summertime, and they follow really regular seasonal patterns throughout the years, where soil CO2 efflux predictably increases in the summer, decreases in the winter, and follows this generally like sinusoidal pattern. And then we see this reflected in the temperature relationships, which is the plot right below the time series, which shows a very exponential trend between temperature and CO2 flux. So this indicates that temperature is basically a really strong driver of CO2 flux and is causing that seasonality we see in the data. And then for our fairly performing sites, in general, we see a lot more spiky data, not as sinusoidal. And you can see this reflected in the temperature relationships, where we don't see temperature having this exponential pattern. We see this cluster of dots which have no clear correlation. So this could potentially be contributing to the model failing in these sites. And then similarly for our poorly performing sites, we again see that cluster of temperature CO2 flux points, no clear trend, like lots of spiky data, and a general overestimation of simulated data compared to observed data, which kind of indicates that the model is really overestimating the impact of temperature on CO2 flux, and it's applying that relationship to sites where temperature is not a strong driver. So then we can ask the question, what is driving model performance? Is it data or site attributes? And what that means is if we had more data for sites like distributed globally, could we create a perfect model? Or are some sites fundamentally just harder to predict just because of their spiky data? So first we can look at data length. So data length is basically the number of data points at each site. And we can see how that correlates with model performance. So we see that where there's like this threshold type relationship between number of data points and model performance, where past around 500 points of data or around 1.5 years, we see a significant increase in model performance. But if you could bring in the animation, we also see that a lot of sites with less than 500 points of data or just not a lot of data still performed really well. So data can't be the only thing driving model performance if we see sites with very sparse data performing super well. So next we looked at other aspects of data that were more correlated to climate. So these are data smoothness and regularity. So smoothness and regularity are like what we saw in those well-performing well-performing sites with those strong sinusoidal dynamics throughout the years and strong temperature relationships. And we saw that smoothness and regularity were highly correlated to model performance across our metrics. So this is probably due to the fact that well-performing sites tended to cluster in temperate and moist climates with high seasonality and strong temperature relationships. So if you bring in the animations, so first we see that most of our well-performing sites, which are the green dots in this figure, are clustered from 30 to 60 latitude. So that's a very temperate zone of the globe. It's also where most of the data for soil CO2 efflux exists. And next animation. Yeah, we also see that, oh, sorry, could you go back one? We also see that, sorry, I was just like, this bottom left figure down here of mean annual temperature versus mean annual precipitation of all the sites. We see that our well-performing sites are clustered at really temperate temperature ranges. So again, this kind of implies that there's something about the specific climate of the sites that are performing well that is driving performance, not just the fact that there's more data in these temperate climates. So overall, we saw that sites with high seasonality, strong temperature responses were able to perform well, while those with more irregular dynamics, weak temperature relationships, and extreme climates performed poorly. So let's go through some implications of this on using deep learning as a tool for global soil CO2 efflux models. One, if we're trying to understand how we can improve these models, more data can help to some extent, meaning that if we equalize the data inequality we see across the globe where most data is concentrated in temperate zones, we might be able to see improved model performance in more extreme climate types with non-temperate climates. However, we see that models like this one, which rely on really large-scale predictor data, meaning data that's derived from remote sensing missions, and it's like at a really coarse spatial resolution, may have limited performance in sites where temperature is a weaker driver than things like precipitation or soil moisture or vegetation dynamics, which are all like plot scale dynamics. So for sites like these where those variables are stronger drivers, a global model like this one may not be able to capture the full range of variability. And then finally, global models may face enhanced difficulty in the future as the globe experiences more rapid changes and transitions to more extreme climate types, particularly arid climate types. So we might see that this struggles that deep learning models are currently facing will just be exacerbated in the future. But more data can always help. So yeah, that's what I found so far.
Thank you, Val. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this finishes the deep learning part of the presentation. So I'm going to introduce a bit of regulatory transfer modeling and the plan for thinking about individual unique places. So we plan to look into the carbon flux and carbon processes in two sites. One is the East River, which is a LBL SFA site. It's in high elevation mountain, Colorado. We know it's experiencing reducing snow, and there's different timing and magnitude of snow. They all lead to more probability of droughts and longer droughts, etc. And then the other side, the Tempest, which has a risk of a lot of coastal flooding, which also would be the example of extreme events. Both sides have a lot of data in terms of stream flow, stream chemistry, stream carbon, dissolved carbon, but also there's a lot of soil CO2 effluxes. Potentially also have some river CO2 evasion data. So these data will be used to calibrate the model and thinking about the detailed processes that drive the different fluxes. So just a little bit of regulatory transfer model. I introduced because this is more of a national lab audience, so I suppose most of you are really familiar with regulatory transfer models. So it's essentially a regulatory transfer model. Typically, they all solve for mass conservation for concentration of solutes in water. And this is one example equations, essentially saying mass change rate is mass change is due to several major processes. The first one is the dispersive diffusive transport, which is essentially saying, the solutes spread because of the variation in flow and the concentration gradient. And the second term is advective transport, which is how much water flow leads to the spreading of solute to different places. That's advective transport. And then you have the reaction process, which is a summation term, meaning it could have multiple reactions happening as long as you have one solute, participating in multiple reactions. It'll be multiple term in this one, and including reaction stoichiometry, different type of reaction happening, but the rates will also depend on reaction thermodynamics and reaction kinetic, etc. So we usually write this type of equation for a few, major we call primary species, which is a building block of the system. And then we have initial conditions, boundary condition defining, how things started, what is a boundary input are, and then we solve for these equations to get concentration as a function of time and space. I used to say in my rapid transfer modeling class, your life trajectory can be solved by these rapid transfer models, essentially keeping track of where things are happening and how much things are happening. So traditionally, the rapid transfer model has been more used in subsurface environment. We're thinking about, for example, nuclear waste disposal, carbon sequestration, remediation, contaminant transport, etc. So there's a lot of really well-known code in national labs, which I think most of you are very familiar with. And then in recent years, there is new development in watershed rapid transfer model, which is essentially integrating hydrometeorologic conditions in terms of temperature, precipitation, what's the surface condition, and how they determine the movement of water in the watershed scale, and then how much trees, vegetation taking water away, and then how much is happening in the water and in soil in terms of biogeochemistry. And all these processes together leads to what we see and what we measure in terms of solutes in river and streams. And so we started with BioRT flux pin, which is more like spatially explicit models, thinking about spatial topography, all the distribution of material mass in different places and reactions. And we end up also later doing we call a more simple parsimonian reactor transfer model, which is a new development in terms of BioRT, HBV. Thinking about watershed, it's kind of more in a simple term as big boxes, and then how much reaction happening in the vertical zone, in different zone in terms of ground surface, in terms of shallow soil zone, deeper zone, groundwater, and how different reaction leads to the changes or concentration in river and stream. And this transition comes from this realization that a lot of things that we look at in terms of concentration in river and streams is very much determined by the flow path in the subsurface and the distinct chemistry of soil in different zones and material in different zones. And so this leads to us to develop a simpler model. So some of my later example will be mostly using this simpler model. So just give you an example of this type of model. What do we do here? So there's precipitation temperature data we use to essentially as external forcing to drive in the model, and we use the HBV model to solve these equations to calibrate stream flow data first. And then we have this model output of water storage, water flow from different zones, and we have the reaction added in different zones. So here's an example of what's happening in the shallow zone in terms of reactions. So we put these relatively lumped reaction, not in every detail of what all the different chemicals come in. So essentially soil respiration, we're thinking about organic carbon and roots, and it produce, for example, CO2 gas, dissolve inorganic carbon. Some intermediate reaction products usually is considered dissolved organic carbon. They can also absorb on the solid phase. So soil can potentially serve as a storage. There's also the weathering reactions, like this is example is from Sleepers River in Vermont, which is a critical zone site. And in this site, it's a carbon formation. So there's a lot of dissolution precipitation happening that leads to DIC coming out. And then between the different DICs, soil use depend on pH condition. You have different species in and out, but also it exchange with the gas phase. So we have CO2 gas could accumulate, form bubbles, and eventually go to efflux as well. So for now, the models that we have been already applied has been mostly focused on the dissolved organic carbon, dissolved inorganic carbon, and using stream flow and stream chemistry data for calibration. So for this project, we'll need to add soil CO2 effluxes and process related to soil CO2 movement and production in these reactor transfer models. Now, so with these reactions and with the water flow paths, all these together, we can look at, for example, at a daily scale, how the dynamics look like. So here you are looking at discharge and temperature, the first row for 2 years from October 2015 to October 2017. And you are looking at the annual cycle of temperature, but also a lot of peaks that showing, big discharge when, big storms are there or just a big snow melt at the site as well. And if you look at both DOC and DIC in terms of production, how much is being produced from the reactions from both soil respiration and carbonate weathering, the lighter pink is showing the patterns kind of very similar to the temperature cycle. So essentially production in this site is more driven by temperature. But export, which is how much of these dissolved organic carbon, dissolved inorganic carbon coming out from the land into the river and streams, they have these peaks that looks very similar to the discharge. So essentially the timing and the size of peak. So essentially the export is more or less driven by the hydrology, by the timing of the big flow events. We can also look at annual scale and think about which zone is doing how much and doing which processes, dominating what processes. So essentially, when we look at both shallow zone and deeper zone, the shallow zone tend to produce much more, almost 100% of dissolved organic carbon. And then this dissolved organic carbon being produced would transport into the deeper zone, become further respired to transform into DIC. So essentially the shallow zone do a lot of production most of production for DOC and almost 70% of a DIC production. And there's another about 30% of DIC being produced in the deeper zone. And then in terms of export, shallow zone export 100% of DOC, about 20% of DIC, and then most of DIC is actually exported from the deeper zone, 80%. So this is interesting because usually we think the shallow zone is very active, doing a lot of carbon processes. These numbers essentially indicating there's a substantial amount of deep respiration and lateral export of dissolved carbon from beneath soil, from the deeper zone. And the other thing is interesting, we can use this model is almost like doing these thought experiments because we can put in different processes. This rapid transfer equation it's essentially a collection of our existing knowledge in terms of what processes are important. So we can add reaction, we can remove reaction to see how important they are. So I just talked about the deep respiration process turned out to be important in terms of both production and export of dissolved carbon. Usually we know that the soil organic carbon tend to be much more abundant in shallow zone and lower in deeper zone. So DOC are being produced a lot in the shallow zone. But if we don't put deep respiration process at all in the deeper zone, we tend to have essentially the same concentration of DOC in the shallow and deeper zone. And in the stream, we will see essentially concentration very similar in high flow and low flow because water coming out from different zones, they have very similar DOC concentration. However, if we put the DOC respiration in the deeper zone, essentially that process consumes DOC and become DIC. So it's adding DIC to the deeper zone, but remove DOC from the deeper zone. So essentially in the lower zone, you have much lower DOC concentration, which means when at low discharge, when the deeper zone water tend to dominate in stream, we see much lower concentration. But then when at high discharge, wet condition, a lot of water coming from the shallow zone, you see signature of this high DOC coming out. So this flushing pattern we're talking about usually is largely because of deep respiration that's happening. And then this is not just for, this particular site, Sleepers River. It's actually DOC, this almost universal flushing pattern have been observed in many different sites, not only US, but also, globally. So it's a very common flushing pattern. So that, different reactions in the different process, which lead to processing in different concentration in different zones can explain that. And Similarly, because of DOC being consumed in the deeper zone and adding DIC to the deeper zone, and you essentially see it leads to this very commonly observed, we call dilution pattern, which is the concentration decrease with discharge for dissolved inorganic carbon. So that I'm showing some utility of how to use these reaction trends model to think about different processes and explain different patterns. And there's a lot of work need to be more kind of thinking through in terms of thinking about the vertical fluxes, integrating both lateral and vertical fluxes. So I'm going to kind of have a little bit of a summary in terms of thinking about, we talk about both of deep learning models, and there will be more development in the physical-based reactive transfer modeling in terms of having the soil CO2 efflux component in the system. In general, we think about the deep learning models. They can fill the data gap, but it doesn't tell us which processes are happening. So it's acting kind of like a black boxes. For physics-based reactive transfer model, we know what's the equation, what are the equation, what are the processes we put in the model. So these are more like glass boxes. So hopefully in the future we could develop more of what we call gray boxes, which is integrating the strengths of both model and thinking about physics-based deep learning approaches. And I want to emphasize at the end that thinking about understanding and forecasting under climate extreme is very challenging because, first of all, we don't have a lot of data in these climate extreme events because extreme events, by definition, they are very rare. So the time it happens are rare, but also the physical condition for these correction of these data tend to be much more challenging. So we usually would have low data, very small amount of data in extreme events, which means the deep learning model potentially wouldn't be performing really well in these events. But the other is the lack of knowledge on these dynamics. Because we lack data, we don't have a lot of process-based understanding of these during these conditions, and these conditions usually they might be very different from normal condition, like we see in a previous example from Rodrigo's work. So the understanding and forecasting in this event tend to be challenging, and I think we need to think a lot more in terms of conditions, in terms of what we can do to understand these better under extremes. And I'm going to stop here so we have time for more discussion.